Okay, so we're ready now to talk a little bit about the structure of the heart. So the heart is found in the center of the thoracic cavity as a part of the mediastinum, which is a clump of connective tissue and other organs that are deep to the sternum and medial to the pleural cavities. And they're well protected. The heart is well protected there, with the sternum protecting from the front, the vertebral column protecting from the posterior, and the lungs and the diaphragm protecting from other directions around the heart. It's a hollow cone-shaped organ, muscular. What kind of muscle would that be? I'll let you think about that for a second. Hopefully you thought to yourself, yes, it's cardiac muscle. So it's built of cardiac muscle plus a lot of connective tissue fibers, so it's very elastic and strong. And it pumps the blood from the chambers of the heart up into the great arteries and veins that come off of the heart. It is, because it's there between the vertebral column and the sternum, external pressure can be used to, in the form of CPR, can be used to force blood out of the heart. And then if we can get somewhat oxygenated blood, or air, into the lungs, then we can circulate better circulate the needs of a person who's not breathing and whose heart is not pumping. So there's some crazy naming to it. And it's just weird. I can't explain it. I'm sorry. I hate it, but there it is. The base is the most superior portion of the heart, and it is where all of the great arteries and veins enter or exit, depending on whether it's an artery or a vein. The tip of the heart, the most inferior portion, is referred to as the apex. So, if we think of the heart here, kind of a cone-shaped organ, this would be the apex, and up here where the aorta and the other blood vessels are entering and exiting, there's the inferior vena cava. This region here would be considered the base of the heart. Okay, so it is surrounded by what are referred to as the pericardia. So again, here's the heart with its blood vessels. It looks more like a strawberry, but hopefully you got the idea. And surrounding the heart, there are layers of connective tissue and some serous membrane that protect the heart. And so it's this double fold. So I'm going to try to... let's see if I can do that again. So this is the heart, and here are some veins and arteries coming out of it. There is a layer of that membrane that adheres directly to the surface of the heart. And then up here it folds and comes back around. Hopefully this is looking a little familiar to you. And then out here on the outside we have a really fibrous, tough, strong additional layer. This outer layer is the fibrous pericardium, and it is a layer of dense, irregular connective tissue, very tough. The protein fibers are laying at all crazy angles to each other, so that no matter which way you pull on it, it is very difficult to rip or tear. And then it is lined, this fibrous pericardium is lined on the inside with a serous membrane. That would be the parietal pericardium. It's the serous layer that lines the wall. And then this part here that adheres and is attached to, has fibers that extend into the muscular layer of the heart, that's the visceral pericardium. And it is also a serous layer. And in between them, this area here that I'm filling in now, that's a cavity, and it's filled with fluid. with pericardial fluid. So, and as a serous fluid, the question then, what is the function of this cavity with the fluid lining in there? I'm sorry, with the fluid laying in there, not lining. It's there to provide lubrication, so that as the heart pumps and moves within the pericardial cavity, as it's moving, expanding and contracting during the relaxation and then the contraction phases of the heartbeat, it doesn't scrape muscle directly against fibrous pericardium. That would be damaging to the heart at some point. Now, because we've got that cavity there and it's fluid filled, it's also incompressible, that fluid is. And so if too much fluid builds up in here, that can provide pressure against the heart, so that when the heart muscle relaxes, it cannot expand, allowing the cavities inside the heart to fill. That's called congestive heart failure, when the heart can't relax enough and enlarge the cavities inside enough so that the blood can rush in. It's a real problem for people who deal with congestive heart failure. Okay, so now let's go deeper into the actual layers of the heart. And so if this is, here's the wall of the heart, we've got that outermost layer. We just described it as the visceral pericardium, but it also has another name. This outer layer that adheres to and part of the heart wall, that's the epicardium, and it's the most superficial layer of the heart wall, and again, it's a serous membrane. The thickest part of the heart is this middle layer here. This is the muscular layer, and that's what myo means. If you recall back to when we did our chapter on the muscular system, myo means muscle. So the myocardium is the muscle of the heart. And again, what kind of tissue? Hopefully you got that very quickly. This time, of course, it's cardiac muscle tissue. And then there are also blood vessels and lymph vessels and neurons, the nerves that run through this myocardial layer. And then on the inside, we have a layer that's referred to as endocardium. Endo means within or inside. And it is an endothelial layer. It's a simple squamous connective tissue. And that lining, every time a blood vessel leaves the heart, its endothelial layer goes with it. So it's continuous with the blood vessels that are attached to the heart. And at the very smallest, so this is still more heart muscle, here's the epicardium, the very smallest of blood vessels, the capillaries, are just a layer of endothelium, that simple squamous epithelium. Last thing, the endocardium is where we find the Purkinje fibers. And these are a specialized form of cardiac muscle cell that is responsible for carrying the signal to contract. They are not contractile cells. So even though they are cardiac muscle, they don't contract, but they do carry information to give to the contracting cells of the heart. And they are, they tell those cells it's time to contract now. Let's see, what else to say? I forgot to mention, I'm sorry, that the myocardium forms, if you look on page 569, so you might want to pause the recording for just a second. Page 569 shows a picture of the myocardium, and the myocardial muscle fibers are arranged so that they spiral up through the heart. So that if you can now imagine those muscle fibers contracting, they're not just going to clamp the heart down and make it decrease in diameter, but as they contract, that spiral kind of springs up and it draws the apex of the heart closer to the base of the heart. And so that adds like a little ringing action that really squeezes blood out of the chambers of the heart as it contracts. So it really increases the efficiency of the heart contraction. Okay, so now let's talk about the chambers and valves. You've already seen my cheesy heart drawing of the chambers and valves. So I'm just going to use words here, but the upper chambers of the heart, here, well, actually I can add a little bit of a drawing, maybe a not so cheesy drawing. In the upper part of the heart, the two chambers are the atria. They're at the base of the heart. And, oh shoot, I should say, that's interesting. The right atrium, oh, actually, that's what I need to say here, is that it receives blood returning from the systemic circulation and the pulmonary circulation. So it receives blood coming back from both of those circulation patterns. These are relatively small chambers. Their myocardium is relatively thin. They do contract and they do squeeze blood into the ventricles, but they don't they don't need that same thickness because they're not pushing the blood near as far. They're separated from each other by the interatrial septum, and this is where when children are born with an incompletely developed heart, frequently it's that there is a gap here in that interatrial septum. That is very adaptive early in fetal development because there are no lungs, the lungs are there, but they don't have any action yet. They're just, they're all kind of closed up, they're filled with fluid. They're not working the way they will once the baby is out of the uterus. So the blood mixes between the two chambers of the heart so that every time it pumps, there's oxygenated blood going to both the heart and to the body and to the lungs. But that seals up in about the last month of pregnancy, and so that is, that's a birth defect that can occur. As they contract, the blood moves toward the apex of the heart and into the much larger ventricles. Each atrium has like a little extra expandable flap to it called the auricle, and it's just a small sac that can take additional blood if the heart is really pumping forcefully. If it's moving a lot of blood at one time, then that can allow it to expand ever so slightly. The valves here between the atria are the right and left atrioventricular valves. We'll give them some other names later on. You've already learned many of those, so I'm not going to be real, that's not huge important right now. Okay, the inferior chambers of the heart are the ventricles. They are toward the apex of the heart, and they receive the blood that is being pumped from the atria. They are larger. So I'm drawing here. So they are larger in general than the atria are. I should have drawn them to go way up in here to highlight that largeness. And they have a much thicker myocardial layer, especially the left ventricle. And we'll talk about that, why it's so important that its myocardium be so much thicker. And as the ventricles contract, they force blood upward toward the base and out the aorta or out the pulmonary trunk. And they go through either a pulmonary valve or the aortic valve to get into the aorta or the pulmonary trunk. Those valves may also be called the aortic semilunar valve and the pulmonary semilunar valve because the flaps of the valves look like little half moons. And they're pushing out the blood either into the pulmonary circulation or the systemic and the coronary circulations. Coronary. The valves there are all about ensuring one-way movement of blood between the chambers. So they're preventing the blood from backflowing. And in order to do this, so like if we were to draw, here's an atrium, and here's the ventricle, and I should have left a little gap there. So the valves are set up so that blood can push through them, and they're tied back to the wall of the heart with these things called chordae tendineae. I'm drawing them as little dotted lines, and they connect down to a papillary muscle, so that when this, so now we're looking at the heart, if you can imagine this, so when this muscle around the ventricle contracts, then blood pressure will reach up and clamp these valves open, so that we can build pressure in here, enough pressure that we can open the next set of valves that are going to carry blood, say, up to the pulmonary trunk. And so we've got these valves here that are going to open up as blood pressure squeezes these closed. Blood pressure will also open these up. And so one heartbeat consists of a single contraction of the two atria at the base of the heart, followed after a short delay by the simultaneous contraction at the exact same time of the two ventricles. Okay, so hopefully that was helpful. Okay, so now let's work our way through the chambers. If we're a little bit of blood, then we are now following the pathway where we've just come in from the systemic circuit. So the blood, it's going to be low oxygen, high CO2. It's going to be flowing in from the systemic circuit, and it gets there by two large veins, the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. And it also is going to receive a little bit of blood from the coronary sinus that is also going to be low oxygen, and it's bringing in blood from the coronary circulation. And when the right atrium squeezes, at the same time that the left atrium is also squeezing, the blood will exit the right atrium and head to the right ventricle, and it passes through along the way that right AV valve, also known as the tricuspid valve. Tricuspid because it has 3 teeth to it. So if you look at the valve from the top, you can see 1 tooth, 2 tooths, and then a 3rd tooth. So it's got 3 flaps to it. So blood then flows through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle, which receives the low oxygen blood that came from the right atrium. The chordae tendineae and their associated papillary muscle brace each one of those teeth, each one of the flaps of the tricuspid valve, and that ensures that as back pressure closes those valves, they seal properly without prolapsing, without flopping back into the right atrium. The valve can flop it back into the right atrium if it prolapses. And so that's possible, much more likely not here at the tricuspid valve, but to actually occur over at the bicuspid valve in the left side of the heart. So the blood then, as the right ventricle squeezes, as it contracts, the blood exits through the pulmonary valve, or pulmonary semilunar valve, whichever one you wish to call it, and it travels through the pulmonary trunk and then splits to the right and left pulmonary arteries, which then become smaller and smaller until they meet until those blood vessels become the capillaries of the lungs. And there gas exchange occurs, and so the carbon dioxide that's in the blood travels out into the air in the lung passages, and the oxygen that's in the lung passages moves into the blood, and gas exchange has occurred. Okay, so now we've gotten the blood to the lungs. Let's get it back to the heart again. So the pulmonary veins, there's 2 from the left and 2 from the right, for a total of 4 pulmonary veins. They bring the now high oxygen blood that is low in carbon dioxide back to the left atrium. And then as the left and right atrium squeeze simultaneously, the blood exits to the left ventricle and it passes through the left AV valve, which is also known as the mitral valve or the bicuspid valve. So 3 names for that one. I'm very sorry about that. So again, with the name bicuspid, that hopefully now makes sense to you. There are 2 flaps to it. So if you look down into the left AV valve, you would see that it just has 2 flaps to it. And that's why it is so prone to prolapse. Not only are there just 2 valves, rather than splitting the blood pressure that develops there in the left ventricle, rather than splitting it among 3 valves, there is only 2 valves there to take it. So each of those valves, each of the flaps, sees a little bit more blood pressure than a tricuspid valve on that side would see. And then there's also this. The heart muscle there is thicker, it's stronger, it has to really squeeze hard to pump blood all the way to the tip of the head and all the way out to the tips of the toes. And so it develops even more pressure than the right ventricle develops. And so it's got the double whammy. It has less equipment to do a harder job because it's got to withstand more pressure and only has 2 valves to do it with. And so that's why it is so prone to mitral valve prolapse. And so when the mitral valve prolapses, if this is the atrium, and here's the mitral valve with its 2 flaps, and here is the ventricle, here are the chordae tendineae. What happens is that these chordae tendineae get so stretched that when it goes to close, this one, rather than closing, actually inverts and gets released so that the blood can flow, as it prolapses toward the atrium, the blood can flow in the gap between the 2 cusps. It can flow right back up toward the right atrium. So we get reverse flow. That's mitral valve prolapse. Also can be called a heart murmur because it makes that swooshing noise as the blood goes the wrong direction. Okay, so assuming that the heart is functioning properly, that valve is not prolapsing, then all the blood will move from the left atrium into the left ventricle. So now we're moving that high O2 blood into the left ventricle. And then once again, the left ventricle squeezes at the same time that the right ventricle is squeezing. That generates enough blood pressure then that forces the mitral valve to close and then opens the aortic valve, also called the aortic semilunar valve, and then the blood flows out into the systemic circulation through the aorta and carries the oxygen that it picked up at the lungs out to the body. So, the big question, why is the left ventricle so much smaller and more thick-walled than the right ventricle? Why does it have to have this big, thick wall? Well, we've kind of already answered that already. But if you want to pause, write your answer about that somewhere, and then we'll check and see how you fare. So here it comes. If you haven't paused it, pause it now. It's because the left ventricle has to push blood so much further. It produces somewhere between 4 and 6 times the pressure that's developed over in the right ventricle, because the right ventricle only has to push the blood out to the lungs and then back again. So greater distance working against gravity is what's required of the left ventricle. The right ventricle, it just has to squeeze blood laterally. It almost does not even working much against gravity. Okay, so the blood supply to the heart, it is provided by the coronary circulation. This is our last slide for this lecture, part of the lecture. It's supplied by the right and left coronary arteries. They are the first branches that come from the aorta just as it departs the heart. And the blood goes out to capillary beds or capillary networks that are interspersed among all of the cells of the myocardium. And then blood returns and returns through the cardiac veins, and it all gets pushed into the coronary sinus on the posterior surface of the heart. And then from there it's dumped directly into the right atrium. And so if one of these arteries gets blocked up, either because of an embolus or because the atherosclerosis, the narrowing of that artery because of the buildup of plaques inside the wall of the artery. So if this is the blood vessel wall, a plaque is like an accumulation of a cholesterol-like substance. So it can constrict and narrow the artery. It can completely fill the artery with plaque, or it can make it narrow enough that when a small circulating blood clot or some other kind of embolus arrives, it gets lodged here and it can't move past, and it blocks the flow of heart. That results in what is called an infarct or tissue death downstream of the of that blockage. And when it happens in the myocardium like this, we talk about it as a myocardial infarction. So it's the production of an infarct because of blockage in the vessels that are filling that are serving the cardiac muscle of the heart. So that myocardial infarction is also referred to as an MI. Okay, so there we've talked a lot about the structure of the heart, the names of the different structures, and the pathway of blood as it flows first in from the systemic circulation out to the pulmonary circulation, back in to the heart again, and then out once again to the systemic circulation. So we've talked that pathway through, and then we've talked a little bit about this additional blood supply, the coronary circulation. So I will see you in the next